All right, welcome everyone to the very last topic from time. Now, once again, I'm working through the Year 7 syllabus in Australia, where I'm from. So, the syllabus so far for time, at least in Australia, it's quite tiny. So, this is the last video out of four. This is all we're going to cover from this particular topic, and we'll get more in depth with time when we go into the content from later years. But for now, this is where we're going to stop as far as it goes with year 7 time, which I'm going through here. So here we're looking at time zones, and I've attached a partial map of the world. It doesn't have all of the countries here, but I'm just going to use this to go through a couple of examples. And in that, I'm hoping I can give you some real world relevance. So I'm going to give you some anecdotes and examples from my own life with as it relates to this kind of stuff. And you can even try some of these questions if maybe you're going traveling somewhere or you've been somewhere recently, or if you have family from another part of the world, because this is actually quite a relevant topic, at least to worldwide applications of time. So on this map that I've shown here, we actually have split up the world into a bunch of different sections. So, where we work from, depending on our position on our world map or our partial world map, we are going to see that across the world, there are very different. There are very different times around the world, and we call these time zones. So all of these little blue lines that you see splitting up my map here. So these ones kind of going down here, and they change a little bit as well depending on countries. But these tell us that each portion of the map falls within a different hour. So another thing here is that as we go in the right direction, so if we go towards the right, we're looking at 1 hour ahead. So each of these little intervals is just looking at 1 hour forward. So this interval, for example, this 2 at the top, that's going to be 1 hour ahead of 1. 3 is going to be 1 hour ahead of 2, or 2 hours ahead of 1, and so on and so forth. So as we move towards the right, our time gets 1 hour ahead, 1 hour greater. And as we go back this way, we're going 1 hour behind. And this map that I've drawn in here will hopefully illustrate that a little bit. And you can see it with the times down the bottom here. So for example, if it was 10 o'clock here, in this part of the world, it's going to be 7 o'clock, or 3 hours behind that. And we can see that the difference between 10 and 7 is going to be 3 hours. So this is a pretty important idea, is that when it's, for example, a particular time in one part of the world, it's actually a totally different time in another part of the world. Now, there's a lot of science that goes into this, kind of how the Earth rotates on its axis around the sun, things like that. But that's more a sciencey topic, which we can get to at some other point. Here we're just looking at the maths and how we can calculate different times around the world. So I said that I would apply this to myself. Now, I live in Australia, which is this country here. And the part of Australia that I live in is New South Wales. I live in Sydney, so that's going to be kind of around here, this little red dot on my map. So I live in this part of the world, and this is actually, you can see it's towards the right of my map. We're one of the countries that's quite a bit ahead when it comes to time. And I have some family. A lot of my family lives in Europe, kind of up here. And particularly, I have a lot of family from a country called Serbia, which is one of these little countries over here. It's so small that it doesn't even really have a name on the map because there wouldn't be enough space for the writing. So I a lot of the time have to call my family back in Serbia. So when I call them, this is where time zones are relevant. I don't want to call them at a time they're sleeping, right? So I have to arrange the time that I communicate with them to be a time when they're awake and I'm awake. And there might be times when they want to call me, but it'll be maybe 3 a.m. in Australia, whereas it's a different time there. So we have to take into account these time zones when we sort of communicate with one another. And now, for example, if we look at these dots that I've drawn here, and let me just draw a dot roughly where in the world my family is. That's, I don't know, around here somewhere. I want to figure out how many hours behind Australia is Serbia, where my family's from. So I can look down and see that, okay, Serbia falls in this part of my time zone, and Sydney, where I'm from, falls in this kind of bracket. So if I look at the difference between where I'm from and where I live and where they live, that's 10 minus 1. So that gives me 9 hours. So I am where I live 9 hours ahead of where my family lives in this little country in Europe. So I can use this to answer some questions. So, for example, if it's 7:30 p.m. in Australia, I want to see what time is it in Serbia, where my family's from. So I can calculate this, right? So I want to see how at what time. So say I want to. It's 7:30 where I am in Australia, and I want to call or text one of my relatives. Well, I need to calculate what time it is over there to see if it's an appropriate time to call them. So I know from my diagram here that the time in Serbia is 9 hours, and it's to the left of Australia on this map. So it's going to be 9 hours behind. So the time in Serbia is 9 hours, is 9 hours behind Sydney in Australia. So I want to find this time. I'm going to take my current time in Australia, and if the time in Serbia is 9 hours less or 9 hours behind, I'm going to take 7:30 p.m. and minus 9 hours from there. So let me draw my little timeline again because I find those kind of useful to work through. So it's 7:30 in Australia. So I want to see what 9 hours less than that is. And now I know that from, for example, 7:30 p.m. until midday, 12 p.m., that gives me how many hours? Well, that gives me 7.5 because from 12 to 7:30, that has been 7.5 hours. Now, I want 9 hours less, so I'm going to find, well, what's 1.5 hours less than 12 p.m.? And that gives me, when I do 12 minus 1.5 hours. 12 minus 1 hour is 11 a.m. And then minus half an hour from that, that gives me 10:30 a.m. So that, at this particular point in time, 7:30 in Australia, or in Sydney, more specifically where I'm from, it's going to be 10:30 a.m. for my relatives in Serbia. So this actually may not be an appropriate time to call them because they'll probably be at work at 10:30 a.m. So this is a really important application of time and time zones here. Now, another way we could have done this, we could have converted 7:30 p.m. to 24-hour time. So I could have gone, all right, 7:30 p.m. equals midday plus, let me do this again, plus this, 7:30, and I would have gotten 19:30, and then I could have just done 19:30 minus 9 hours, and that would have given me 10:30, or 10 in regular time, 10:30 a.m. So there's multiple ways we can kind of go around here. We can kind of go about this. But here you can see we're applying our time intervals and we're taking that and looking at different times around the world. So we're kind of applying everything we know about time here. Now, let me give you another example. So in January, for example, I'm going to be traveling to Thailand. So that's this country over here. And you can see that this country lies here. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see. So I can count and say, well, how far behind is Thailand from Australia? So I can draw this in and go, all right, well, from 7 to 10, this is going to be 3 hours. So it's all about perspective, right? So if I'm in Australia and I'm, say, thinking about what's the time in Thailand from the perspective of Australia, Thailand's 3 hours behind. Now, if I'm in Thailand at the moment, I can say, well, Australia's 3 hours ahead. This is this particular thing I've drawn down the bottom here. It's all about perspective. But from the perspective of Australia, for example, oh no, let's go. We looked from the perspective of Australia in the last question. Let's look from the perspective of Thailand. So we know that that Australia is 3 hours ahead of Thailand. So let's write this down. So let's say, sorry, more specifically, because you can see Australia covers a few different time zones. Let's look at Sydney in particular, this red dot where I'm from. Sydney is 3 hours ahead of Thailand. So let's fast forward. I'm in Thailand on holiday in January, and I want to call my parents. And it is, let's say, 6:30 a.m. in Thailand. And I want to find the time in Sydney. So I know that Sydney is 3 hours ahead of Thailand. So if I draw my timeline again here, I can say, all right, it's 6:30 a.m. in Thailand. I want to find what time is 3 hours ahead. And that's going to give me my time in Sydney. So if I add 3 hours to 6:30 a.m., I'm going to get 9:30 a.m. And you can see we are adding the hours here. So I'm adding 3 hours. So I'm going from 6 to 9. And that is how we can apply everything we've done to looking at time zones. So if you travel ever, if you go on holidays, this type of stuff's going to be really relevant to you. Or if you're like me and you have family around the world, you can use these time zones as well. And you have to take them into consideration when you're planning to communicate over the phone with your family. So there's a lot of real life application to what we've been doing these past few videos. But thank you so much for joining me. That concludes our topic of time from the Year 7 maths syllabus here in Australia. And I will see you for the next series. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll catch you next time.